In the early 90s, a console war raged, culminating in an epic showdown between Nintendo and Sega. For a glorious period, Sega's Genesis dominated, outmaneuvering its rival with cutting-edge technology and a rebellious attitude. But by the decade's end, Sega was a ghost, its once unbeatable console a distant memory. What happened to the titan that dared to challenge Nintendo? Was it corporate hubris, a string of catastrophic decisions, or something more insidious that led to the seemingly inexplicable downfall of a gaming giant? To truly grasp Sega's vanishing act, we must first understand the height from which it fell. The year is 1989. Nintendo, with its NES, was an unassailable behemoth, holding over 90% of the North American market. They were the king, and everyone else was a struggling pretender. Then came Sega, not with a whimper, but with a roar. Their new console, the Sega Genesis, was a beast. It boasted a faster processor, superior graphics, and a sound chip that could belt out rock anthems. This wasn't just another console. It was an antidote to Nintendo's family-friendly image. Sega positioned itself as the rebellious alternative, the console for older, cooler kids. Their marketing campaign, Genesis Does What Nintendo Don't, was a direct assault, audacious and unforgettable. They offered edgier games, like Altered Beast bundled with the console, and later, the controversial, uncensored Mortal Kombat, while Nintendo's version censored the infamous fatalities. This bold strategy resonated. Sega wasn't playing by Nintendo's rules, they were rewriting them. The Genesis quickly gained traction, especially in North America. When Sonic the Hedgehog burst onto the scene in 1991, Sega found its mascot. A character as fast and spiky as Mario was portly and predictable. Sonic was a phenomenon, propelling the Genesis into the lead, surpassing the Super Nintendo for a time. Sega had achieved the impossible. It had dethroned Nintendo. Their sales figures were astronomical, their brand recognition undeniable. They had momentum, passion, and a dedicated fan base that evangelized for their console. It seemed like nothing could stop them. But the very ambition that drove Sega to such heights would ultimately become its greatest vulnerability. Sega's downfall wasn't a sudden implosion. It was a slow, agonizing bleed. A self-inflicted wound disguised as innovation. The first cracks in the empire began to show not long after their peak. Instead of consolidating their dominance with the Genesis, Sega started splintering it. In 1992, they released the Sega CD, an add-on for the Genesis. The idea was sound. CD-ROMs offered massive storage for full-motion video and richer audio. But the execution was flawed. It was expensive, initially lacked compelling games, and consumers balked at spending another couple of $100 on an attachment for their existing console. Then, in 1994, came the 32X, another Genesis add-on, this one promising 32-bit power, a bridge to the next generation. It was an even bigger disaster. The 32X launched mere months before Sega's next-gen console, the Saturn, leaving consumers utterly confused. Why buy an add-on for an aging system when a truly new one was around the corner? Developers were equally baffled, unsure which platform to prioritize. This wasn't just poor planning, it was an identity crisis. Sega was battling itself, and its messaging was haphazard at best. The market perceived Sega as a company that couldn't commit, constantly chasing the next big thing without fully supporting its current creations. Meanwhile, the crucial American and Japanese divisions of Sega were often at odds, run by strong personalities with conflicting visions. Sega of America, under Tom Kalinske, understood the Western market's aggressive tastes. Sega of Japan, however, often dismissed their strategies, insisting on its own, sometimes insular, direction. This internal friction led to duplicated efforts, wasted resources, and a severe lack of focus. The once clear vision that powered the Genesis was now a blurred mess, obscured by a plethora of peripherals and a company seemingly fighting itself. Developers, once eager to work with Sega, began to look elsewhere, especially as a new player. Sony began to emerge with its PlayStation, promising a unified, developer-friendly platform. The ground was shifting, and Sega, once nimble, was becoming bogged down by its own conflicting strategies. The true climax of Sega's tragedy began with the launch of the Sega Saturn. It was intended to be Sega's savior, their definitive next-generation console, launched in 1995. But once again, Sega stumbled. The Saturn's architecture was notoriously complex, featuring 2 CPUs and 2 video processors, making it a nightmare for developers to program for. While it excelled at 2D graphics, its 3D capabilities, intended to compete with Sony's PlayStation, were less impressive and far harder to extract. To make matters worse, Sega of America, trying to get a jump on the PlayStation, decided on a surprise early launch for the Saturn, 4 months ahead of schedule, with very little notice to retailers and almost no marketing. This alienated major retailers who weren't clued in, creating resentment. The PlayStation, conversely, launched at a lower price point and with a clear message: 3D gaming for the masses. Its developer tools were far more accessible, attracting major third parties like Squaresoft and its upcoming Final Fantasy VII. The Saturn struggled, its sales dwarfed by the PlayStation. Sega was bleeding money. In a desperate attempt to regain lost ground, Sega tried one last roll of the dice: the Dreamcast. Launched in 1999, it was a truly innovative console, featuring stunning graphics, online gaming built in, and a competitive price. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like Sega was back. Games like Soul Calibur and Shenmue showcased its power, but the damage done by the Sega CD, 32X, and Saturn effectively meant 3 consecutive generations of consumer confusion and broken trust. Many gamers simply couldn't justify investing in another Sega console after previous disappointments. Furthermore, the burgeoning PC market and the looming PlayStation 2, already hyped beyond belief, cast a long shadow. Piracy, rampant on the Dreamcast, exacerbated its struggles. Sega couldn't sustain the losses. On January 31, 2001, Sega announced it would cease production of the Dreamcast and exit the console hardware market entirely. The decision was devastating, marking the end of an era for a company that had once dared to stand toe-to-toe with giants. The rebellious challenger had faltered, falling victim to its own internal strife, fragmented vision, and a series of missteps that ultimately proved fatal. The echo of Sega's hardware departure still resonates today, a cautionary tale etched into the annals of gaming history. The failure wasn't due to a lack of talent or innovation. It was a failure of strategy, coherence, and internal communication. Sega had brilliant engineers, visionary designers, and marketing mavericks, but they lacked a unified direction, consistently undermining their own efforts with competing consoles and confusing consumers. Their constant need to be ahead of the curve led to rushed products, poorly supported add-ons, and a legacy of technological prowess squandered. Yet, even in its defeat, Sega offered invaluable lessons to the industry. It taught companies the importance of a clear, singular vision. It demonstrated that even market leaders can fall if they alienate their partners and confuse their customers. And perhaps most poignantly, it showed that being first doesn't always guarantee success, especially if the product isn't ready or the market isn't prepared. Today, Sega survives, not as a console manufacturer, but as a prolific developer and publisher, creating iconic games like the Yakuza series and, of course, continuing the legacy of Sonic. They found a new identity, albeit one forged in the aftermath of a spectacular, heartbreaking collapse. To this day, the what-ifs surrounding Sega's console empire spark endless debates among fans. What if they had focused solely on the Genesis instead of the Sega CD and 32X? What if the Saturn had been easier to develop for? What if the Dreamcast had launched without the shadow of the PlayStation 2? We may never know the definitive answers, but the legend of Sega Genesis, the console that dared to challenge Nintendo and briefly ruled the world, serves as a powerful reminder of the delicate balance between ambition and stability, and how even the mightiest can fall as quickly as they rise. If you want more stories of hidden gaming sagas and developers who dared to dream big, be sure to subscribe and check out our next deep dive into the industry's forgotten chapters.